By the end of this video, we are going to have stunning graphs, dashboards, and visualizations of data and metrics for our Linux servers, Docker containers, Unraid server, Proxmox, and we're going to go through the entire process of how I set everything up. We're going to be using a variety of tools, including Grafana, Prometheus, their node exporter, InfluxDB, and Telegraf. And it may sound like a lot, but I do have all this in a real nice Docker Compose file that you can just go ahead and get cloned from my repository. It comes with the configuration files that you're going to need to get started, and all you need to do is change a couple variables and you're good to go. There's a lot here on the actual article going into the various applications, what they do and how they all work together. I could talk about this forever, but that's not really the purpose of this. But what I will say is there's basically three main components. Grafana is going to be the tool that actually visualizes the data that are in our databases. The databases we're going to be using are Prometheus and InfluxDB, and then from there we have our exporting tools, whether that be the actual node exporter for Prometheus or Telegraf, which we're going to be using to export data system metrics. I'll also note that I'm not doing this in the most secure way possible. I do recommend that if you're going to copy this exact setup, you have this in a closed private network that nobody else can access, because I have not yet set up HTTPS, and I will update that as soon as I can on this article. But there will be a video linked down below from Christian, which goes over some of these steps and does show you how to enable SSL. Also, running something like Prometheus and InfluxDB together isn't really that common of a practice. The main reason I'm doing that is because they both generally have their own pros and cons. I absolutely love the node exporter, which works with Prometheus, but at the same time, InfluxDB is an absolutely beautiful application. And if you're somebody who's not looking for these like really pretty customizable dashboards and you just want a really nice database that helps you visualize the data, you could probably go with only InfluxDB. It's all up to you. And the point of building all this together is more of a kind of home lab environment, a lab to learn, to play around, to have fun. For this video, we are going to be setting this up on Ubuntu, but you could set it up just about on anything that will work with Docker, as this is going to be a Docker Compose stack. Specifically, I spun up this fresh install right here on a Proxmox virtual machine, which we will be able to see later within our Grafana dashboard, which is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and SSH into that virtual machine. There we go, and again, all I did on this machine is update it, so we are literally starting from scratch here. Now, one thing that we can do just to start is install the Prometheus node exporter, because we're going to want to actually monitor the machine that we're installing all this on anyways. And for Ubuntu, it's just going to be a sudo apt install Prometheus node exporter, just like that. It's a really small application, so it doesn't take too much time at all, and then we could check to see if it's running with a systemctl command, and we can see right here that it is active and running. Now, other than that node exporter, we're launching everything with Docker. Right here, I have a link which will take you to this page right here. This is the 7 basics for beginners, and this will go over just about everything you need to know. To go ahead and install Docker, all I need to do is get this convenient script right here, drop that on into my terminal, run the command, and it's going to install everything I need for Docker, Docker Compose, everything like that. Additionally, I am going to want to do this as a non-root user, so I'm going to add my user to the Docker group. That convenient script automatically adds the group Docker. So all I need to do is add my current user to that group, refresh our groups, and now we are good to go. Now I went ahead and put all of my configurations, the Compose YAML, in this right here. This is the server monitoring repository that I went ahead and built. It goes over a lot of different steps. This is a work in progress, and I do plan on adding a lot more to it, including the SSL steps and things like that. And this is just mostly a much lighter version of the entire article if you just wanted to skip that and go straight here. So to actually pull this, we just want to run a git clone command. Let's paste that on in. It's going to go ahead and pull all of that. And now if we ls in this directory, we can see we have our server monitoring folder right there. So let's cd into our server monitoring. We could see how everything is structured here. We have our actual Compose YAML. In Grafana, we have the data source YML. Within Prometheus here, we have our Prometheus configuration file. In Telegraf, we have a Telegraf configuration file. which this is going to be running directly on this machine with everything else. So if there is data such as Docker containers, and I do have an Unraid folder, this is more just extra information on if you do want to set this right here up on Unraid. Now, if I jump into this compose YAML file real quick, this is where we could go ahead and make some edits. And the main thing you're going to want to edit is under extra hosts right here. Where it says Docker Lab, you're going to want to put in your host name, and to find that, all you have to do is type in host name. You can see mine is Docker Lab. So you're going to want to go ahead and change that to whatever yours happens to be. Basically, this is going to enable them to access data exporters running on the host system outside of Docker by adding an entry to the container's etc host file. If you do have DNS set up on your LAN, this probably isn't necessary, but I found it to work the best for me. And then we have our volumes here. We can see prom data is our Prometheus data. It is going to be created as a volume. And right here, this is going to be our configuration file within our current working directory. We have our ports here. If you do have other Docker containers, make sure you're not running containers on the same port. You may need to change this part here. For Grafana, we have our Grafana data also in a volume, and we will have access to edit the data sources if you would like to. For me, I'm not going to need to. For InfluxDB, we're using the Alpine version, and this is also stored in a volume. Again, if you wanted to bind it to either a network share or directly in your host system, you'd want to change that right here. And then for Telegraf, this is just running the latest version of Telegraf. Refer to the Unraid section if you have various packages or various components of your system that you want to monitor. You may want to change this out for a modified container. This is going to be running on host, because to actually use this Docker container to monitor everything, we are going to need to expose it to the root system. Again, that adds some concerns. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can just disable this and not use it. We're also giving the user in the container root privileges, so that's something to keep note of as well, as it can also see the Docker sock as well as the root of our file system. And then we have our environment and our volumes. Now for me, this looks good. I'm going to output this. Now if we go over here, the only other thing we really need to modify before we launch this is the Prometheus configuration. So if I go ahead and give that a copy and paste this on in, we have a lot of variables. We could change the scrape interval and timeout. This is how often that it's actually going to be pulling for data. We have alerting stuff, which I'm not going to get into right now. We have scrape configs, so we have Prometheus already in there, so it's going to automatically show up in Grafana when we add this. And then down here we have targets. We're going to just keep this as localhost. It should be able to grab it just fine. And then right here is our node exporter targets. So node exporter is the very first thing that we installed. So just as an example, I could go ahead and remove this comment on Docker Lab, and that's going to go ahead and set it up as a target. So now our Prometheus database is going to look for this node exporter to pull data. Now one thing here, you could see these are using host names instead of IP addresses. You could just go ahead and pop an IP address in here for a local server or service you have running, but I'm going to output that real quick. And here within the article, we have options for optional host config. I'm going to go ahead and give this a copy and fire this up here. So we can see our local host in our Docker Lab. One thing I'm going to do is add a comment here and do custom host names. If you have this managed on a service throughout your network, you're not going to need to do this, but this is just to make everything pretty within our kind of metrics server here. These right here are some of mine, so I'm going to paste that on in, make this a little prettier. Unraid. So these are all the systems that I'm going to go ahead and be linking up in this video, and providing custom host names just makes it cleaner. That's the IP address, and it's going to link up with this host name. So let's output that and just give our server a quick reboot. So now that we're back in, I'm going to go back into my kind of project directory here and go back to my Prometheus configuration. And I already have the node exporter installed on this machine, so I'm just going to go ahead and uncomment that, and then we will talk about Unraid a little bit later. So let's export this file. Now at this point, we should be able to spin up our stack here. So to do that, we're just going to do a docker compose up-d for detach, so we're not stuck in the terminal. Let's hit enter. I got some fat fingers, you know? There we go. So it's pulling all my packages, extracting everything, and you can see everything is running and looking good. And to check, I do recommend you jump into the logs real quick. So if we do docker compose logs, we can see if there's any major errors or anything spitting out as of yet, which I haven't completely configured everything, so there might be, but for now that is fine. And then the next step is going to be going to some of our dashboards and actually set up our user accounts and whatnot, create a bucket. So first, let's go ahead and set up InfluxDB2. Just to triple check, let's go ahead and check our IP address of this server that we have installed it on. We can see here it's the IP address ending in 36, and we're going to want to head over to 8086. Now from here, we're going to get started. We're going to want to create an account. A lot of people set up these account creations within the Docker Compose, but I find this just a little bit better not to have a password in a file like that. But here I'm going to set our password. For my organization name, I'm just going to call it TechHut. And the initial bucket name, I'm just going to call this InfluxDB, as this is going to be a place that InfluxDB itself is going to want to store some data. So let's continue from there. And this right here, this is your initial token. We're going to be using this quite a bit to link this up. So I do recommend you save this. And of course, you could always go in the admin panel later and generate new API tokens if you'd like to. And we could just click on Quick Start here. And if you did want to generate new tokens and do like application specific with more secure permissions, you just go over here, go to API tokens, and this is the token that was just generated. And all you need to do is click new and then do all access, which the default one here is, or you do custom. And now we could go to Grafana. So this is going to be at the same IP address ending in 3000. Here, I was logged into this earlier, but the default kind of password is going to be admin and admin. And then you're going to want to go ahead and set up a new password and hit submit, save that, and we are in. So the very first thing that we're going to do within Grafana is configure our data sources. Both we're going to make sure Prometheus is working and that InfluxDB. So if we go over here to the navigation menu and go to data sources, we can see Prometheus should already be loaded in there. And we are using the name server right there, which since all these are kind of in the same Docker Compose stack, this uses Docker DNS, so we could use the container names or as actual name servers in between each other. So just to make sure this works, we're going to hit save and test. We can see we have no issues there. And then let's go ahead and add a new connection. This is going to be InfluxDB. So let's add that, add as a new data source. And for this first one, this is going to be Proxmox. Now there's a lot to learn about InfluxDB. For this actual Proxmox data, we're going to be using the InfluxQL language. If you use Flux, a lot of the dashboards don't work, but some of them are really awesome. We'll talk about that later. And using InfluxQL is only really going to pull one of the buckets. So let's do HTTP and then send this to InfluxDB at the port 8086. For this, we are going to skip our TSL verify, and this is going to be our Proxmox bucket. For the password here, we're going to copy that key from earlier, paste that on in. This is going to be a get. We can see here our data source is working with 0 measurements found, and that's because we went ahead and created that fresh bucket. So now we have our first bit of data sources here. It's looking good. This right here is the first dashboard that we're going to be grabbing for that node exporter that we already set up. If you don't know, there are a huge variety of dashboards. If I go over here, this right now is sorted by downloads. You can see there are a ton of different dashboards. A lot of the most downloaded ones are for Prometheus if you want to go through and see exactly what you needed and what services you want to spin up. But just to start, we are going to go with the most popular dashboard, and that is Node Exporter Full. When you see a dashboard that you want, all you need to do is go down here, copy the ID to clipboard, and then we could jump back over to Grafana, go over to dashboards, we're going to go new, and we're going to import a dashboard. Just paste in the ID right here, and then click on load. Now this is going to bring up the options. I'm just going to call this Node Exporter right here, and then we're going to select our data source, and for this is going to be our Prometheus data source. So let's select that, click on import, and boom. Let's make this a little bit bigger real quick so we can see what is going on here. This is data from the Nextcloud server that I spun up that I already installed the Node Exporter on earlier. So you can see it automatically pulls everything. We have our CPU busy, RAM used, a bunch of different information. We could go down here and go into these individual panels of just a ton of different things and metrics. We have system processes here. You can actually see what is going on, how the CPUs are splitting up workloads. I mean, just an absolute comical amount of stuff that we're able to visualize on here. And I just imported this, so there's not a lot of data, but as this kind of fills in, it truly does look beautiful. And we did do 2 of these. So if I go all the way back up to the top from Nextcloud, if I go to my Docker lab, we could see the actual system utilization on this virtual machine that we have Grafana, Prometheus, and all that spun up on. And I mean, if this is all you need to install is Grafana, Prometheus, and the node exporter, and you're good to go at this point. Now, Unraid here is another thing that I would like to monitor. And to do this, all you need to do is go to Apps, and they have a really nice, snazzy Prometheus node exporter that you could grab right here. You can see I already have it installed. All you got to do is install it, make sure that any Docker containers aren't using the port that this uses. And I am going to go back into the Prometheus YAML file and add my Unraid instance, which is right here. Output that. All we need to do now is restart the Docker Compose. So we just go Docker Compose restart. It's going to go ahead and restart all those containers. We should now see the Unraid under host. Click on that, and here is Unraid. This one does take a little bit longer to actually kind of start pulling data, but it does, and soon it will be beautiful. Now, if this and all this data is all you need, that's all. You could stop here. You got Prometheus, you got the node exporters, and this dashboard running. You're good to go. You can monitor your systems, but I am not done. I want to monitor this right here. I want to monitor Proxmox. And we already have the data source in Grafana, plus Proxmox has its own exporter for a metric server built into it that sends data to InfluxDB. And to get to that, all we need to do is go over here to Data Center, scroll down to Metric Server. See, I have a test right there. Let's just ignore that. And then from here, with nothing there, we're going to go ahead and add, and we're going to go InfluxDB. If you prefer Graphite and you want to kind of experiment and play around with it, you could test that out. But let's go Influx, and here I'll call it Docker Lab because that's where this data is going to be exported to. And here, this isn't on that same machine, so I'm going to actually need to use the IP address in this case. So it's going to be at .36, and we are going to use the HTTP protocol for now. Our organization is TechHut. Our bucket is going to be Proxmox, and then we got our API key here. Pop that on in, and before I hit create, I'm going to jump over here to my buckets, go into Proxmox, and you can see there's absolutely no data found. Oh, almost forgot, this is on the port 8086, so let's go ahead and click create, and there we go. If there was a connection issue, it would have told you right here. So now if I refresh this, it might not populate right away. Proxmox, oh, yep, it's there. So we have a bunch of different stuff. And one thing that's really cool is if you just want simple graphs and kind of be able to explore data, this might be good enough for you. So if I go like CPU stats, for example, go CPUs, Proxmox, hit submit, we could see data start to show up. Let's go. Let's open up something with a little bit more variability. Maybe memory used, and hit submit. There we go. So we can see this kind of start to populate here. But let's get a really nice dashboard. So this right here is the dashboard that I like to use for Proxmox. We go ahead and just grab this ID from here and then go straight over to dashboards. We're going to import a new dashboard. So paste that in, hit load. For this, we're going to go with Proxmox for our Influx database source. And you can rename it if you want to, but I am going to go import. And here we go. I'm missing the clock panel. I'll probably try to add that into the Docker Compose to automatically install that. But you go ahead and edit just about anything you see here. So just to get rid of these, I just hit remove, and there we go. Then I could drag this around and really play with it how I see fit. Up here we have our server, Proxmox, storage, local. We could add the local VM. And then under interfaces here, we could add all of our interfaces. So now if we scroll down, we can see just about everything that's going on. We have our LXC containers, all of those spun up and displaying data. We could see the current memory usage, our VM usage. We have our actual disk read writes between all of our various containers and virtual machines. Just really a whole bunch of awesome data now that we can see in Grafana for Proxmox. So that is truly beautiful. And the very next thing we're going to set up is Telegraf, and we're going to be using this to monitor our Docker containers. And what we're going to want to do is head over to our terminal and actually edit our Telegraf configuration here. Right now, at least pulled from this repository, I only have it configured to monitor Docker, but I do have some system-wide variables that you could go to uncomment if you do want that data included. This isn't a full tutorial on how to use Telegraf, but I will leave links to documentation on all these different plugins. But for at least this initial setup, the only thing we should need to configure right here is our outputs plugin, sending the data to InfluxDB version 2. And since this is all in the same stack, this right here, this hostname is going to work, but we are going to need to paste our token right into here. So let's paste that. We have your org. This is going to be TechHut. Now for bucket, I'm going to need to create a new one because I do want a lot of this data separated. I'm going to call this local docker. Save that out, close it. And then we can head over here. Let's go to our buckets and then make a new one. Let's create a bucket for our local docker. Local docker. And also never probably isn't generally a good idea depending on your disk space. I like to go 90 days personally, so let's create that. And now with our new bucket here and the configuration done, let's just go ahead and restart our compose to sync with our new configuration. And now, depending on how quick it's going to work, it signed me out. Let's go ahead and go back in. And here we are, we got Docker. So if we go in here, we could see like NCPUs, Docker lab. Let's submit that. And we're getting some data. Now within Grafana, we're going to want to add a new connection. I'm going to save our dashboard real quick. And this is going to be another InfluxDB source. But this time we are going to go Flux. Now Flux works a little bit different. It can read all the buckets. So I'm just going to leave this as InfluxDB, but I'll call it Flux. Flux is currently in beta. I do recommend you kind of go through and read this if you would like to. So with this Flux, we're going to paste in our InfluxDB URL for HTTP. I'm going to get rid of basic authentication and we're going to skip TLS for now. And right here, we're going to fill in our organization, our token, and you can set a default bucket if you'd like to. This one is going to be Docker Lab for our default. And then we can save and test. And we can see we have 5 buckets found, which is good. So we are going to get the Docker monitoring dashboard. Let's give this a double click, copy that, and then go over here to our dashboards, import a new one, paste this on in and click load. For this, I'm going to go ahead and rename it so it's a little bit prettier and then go with InfluxDB Flux as our source. Let's import that. And here we are. Now our bucket, we are going to want to go to one of these, specifically our local Docker bucket. And we can see it is filling up. So if I open up all these, we have data. Woo! This is our local machine. The only thing I have running is in that compose. So you can see we have InfluxDB2, Prometheus, Grafana, and Telegraf all running. And I can see a nice overview of their actual system resources, including network usage, memory, CPU, and disk usage. Now from there, I want to go ahead and pull the actual Docker containers running in my Unraid instance here, as well as set up a whole separate Unraid container. Now this part was difficult, to say the least, to get set up and working. I actually made a whole separate kind of README repository page of everything that I needed to do to get this working. And now that it is working and I know what to do, it's actually a pretty straightforward process. First, what we need to do is download this right here. This is our Telegraf configuration for Unraid specifically. You go ahead and customize the interval and all that if you would like to. We have our inputs for Docker, but this one for Unraid has a lot of other variables for a dashboard that I'm going to import a little bit later. This includes CPU, disk I/O, a whole bunch of different things. You can even get your UPS in here if you actually have that set up. And there's some information on trying to help you set up NVIDIA if you're interested. Obviously, you are going to have to edit this right here. Jumping into my Unraid dashboard, the first thing you're going to want to do is navigate over to app data and create this Telegraf folder. I actually need to update this configuration, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a quick delete. Head back over here and actually download this raw file. You can see it's completed there. So I'm going to go into my local terminal and edit this real fast. And then the only thing I am going to need to change for now is down here in my outputs plugin. I'm going to create a new bucket called Unraid. I'm going to change this and then paste in our token. And for this, I am going to use an IP address instead of a host name. So this is 10.0.0. This right here is the IP address that we've been connecting to for the dashboards and whatnot. So let's output that and then upload it here. So there it is. Let's go ahead and upload that into Unraid. Now, if you don't know, I'm actually using this file manager right here in Unraid to actually kind of navigate through the web UI if you were curious. But from there, to actually grab this, what you need to do is go over here, search for Telegraf, and they do have an official image. We're not going to use that official image. I already pulled it and have it running. So if I go over to Docker and I go to Telegraf, let's just edit this so you can kind of see what I did here. Name, Telegraf. One thing, you're going to want to switch out the repository. We're using GoLift's image here. This right here is a modified image of Telegraf that includes some extra tools. I spent so much time trying to get the official image to work. After a couple hours, I gave up and ended up finding this. So it includes some extra packages that do make monitoring Unraid significantly prettier and some modifications to the sudoers file so we can actually access the plugins in that configuration. If I go over here to advanced view real fast, we could see some more information. So you're going to want to change the repository URL. We're going to add some extra parameters, giving our user on the container access to the Docker sock. And do make sure you switch this over to bash so this command here will actually run. And other than that, that's all, at least in my setup, that I needed to do. Obviously, make sure if you do have a different path for your configuration, you edit that here and then spin up the container. In my instance, since I updated the configuration, I'm going to go ahead and give it a restart after first I make the actual bucket. So let's go to buckets. This is going to be create bucket, Unraid, older than 90 days. Great. So now in this Unraid bucket, we currently see nothing. But if we go back over here and restart this container and make sure it's all working good, which it seems to be, we have a successful connection. When it comes to setting up metric stuff, logs in Docker are going to be your absolutely best friend. So let's close that out. If we go back to the data exporter, give it a nice little refresh here, go over to Unraid. Oh boy, do we have all the data. You can see all of our Docker stuff here, as well as all those plugins to monitor the specific hardware. And everything I just did is going to be here. You can see the extra parameters, the repository. And now if I go back here, this is our Docker dashboard. So if I give this a quick refresh, under bucket, we should now see Unraid. So if I click on that, we have all of our containers for the viewing. Now this is our Grafana dashboards. I found this one to be the best working one for how I set this up and all that. So from here, let's copy that ID. And before we import that dashboard, let's go over here and add a new connection. Let's go InfluxDB, add as a new source. This is going to use the InfluxQL. Fill this in just how we did before with our skip TLS verify. And this is going to be specifically our Unraid database. Pop in our API token, we're going to get this and then save and test. We can see we found the 20 measurements, beautiful. So now in dashboards, let's go ahead and import it, which is this one right here. Let's load it and then let's use, oh, I forgot to rename it. It's this one though. I normally would rename the actual connection to Unraid. This is our Unraid system dashboard. Let's import it. And there we go. I don't have my UPS set up, so I'm just going to minimize that for now. Look how stunning this dashboard is for Unraid. We have all of our CPU usage with all the different cores. We have the CPU packages and what is taking up what. More CPU information, including the per core temps, load limits. Go down here to memory and network stuff. We have our disks. This was just imported, so it's not going to say anything here, but we have growth history, storage consumption. Smart chart's not working yet. I still haven't yet figured out this part completely, but I just end up getting rid of these for now until I do have it figured out. Going down here, we got our disk writes, read writes. And this is all just data from the last, what is that, like 5 minutes or so? So it's already pulling a lot of different metrics, and just visually, this is beautiful. There's so much more to learn. There's so much more I need to do to like kind of secure this, and it's a lot. So again, that full guide and GitHub page will be linked down below, and within those there will be links to all kinds of documentations to learn more. And with all that, I do hope you have an absolutely beautiful day, and goodbye.